Okay, so we're back with another message, and it's around 3 o'clock right now, but I need to do this right now, or else I might not be able to do it again. So welcome back if you're coming back, and welcome if it's your first time. So in order to be able to really heal from a narcissistic kind of an abuse, you need to destroy the shared fantasy between the two of you or whoever abused you. As it is going to be difficult because the relationship between the two of you is just like the mother-child relationship of unconditional love, and that is hard to break. But you must be aware that you are not dealing with a child, and that is an adult whom, if they wanted to, could easily shift their perception and stop acting like a 5-year-old kid. They're physical adults trapped in their 5-year-old psychology. They want to change their miserable roles so that you are their savior, and then they get freed from their victimized self. They have to understand that they are the only ones who can free themselves. So dealing with a narcissist, especially when it comes to a shared fantasy or idealized vision, can be challenging. Narcissists often have a strong need for admiration and control, which can make it difficult to address or dismantle any shared illusions. And on this topic, I'm going to break it down to part 1 and part 2. The first one is of how to deal with such kind of a situation. And so in order to be able to deal with such kind of a situation, here's a general approach to handling this situation. First and foremost, number 1, recognize the fantasy. Understand that narcissists often create and maintain idealized versions of reality that serve their needs. A shared fantasy could be an unrealistic vision of a relationship, success, or personal identity. So, for example, let's have a scenario where you are in a relationship with Taylor. Let's say you are male and you are in a relationship with someone called Taylor, who has an idealized fantasy about how your life together should look. Taylor envisions a perfect relationship with constant excitement, social success, and flawless harmony. This fantasy often leads to disappointment when real-life challenges arise. So, in order to deal with it, you need to recognize the fantasy. First, you need to identify the idealized vision by observation. Taylor frequently talks about how your relationship should always be filled with romance and adventure. For instance, she might say, we should be traveling to exotic locations every month and always having fun. Our relationship should be perfect all the time, like in the movies. And you have to have a reality check about this. And in the reality check, you notice that real life situations such as financial constraints or personal differences don't align with this idealized vision, leading to frequent dissatisfaction and conflict. So the next thing which you should do is acknowledge the impact of the shared fantasy, the impact which it has on you. Recognize how this fantasy affects you personally. For example, you might feel pressure to meet Taylor's unrealistic expectations or feel inadequate when your life doesn't match the idealized vision. And then you have to acknowledge the impact on the relationship between the two of you. Understand that the fantasy creates ongoing tension and dissatisfaction in your relationship because it's based on an unrealistic standard. And then the third thing you need to do is discuss the fantasy. Have a conversation with Taylor about the discrepancy between the idealized vision and your actual experiences. Use specific examples to illustrate the gap between fantasy and reality. For instance, you could say, I've noticed that we often talk about our relationship as if it should always be exciting and perfect. But I think we are facing challenges that are part of a real relationship. Can we talk about how we can address these challenges together? So in doing that, you propose a realistic kind of a perspective and you try to find a solution. Suggest focusing on practical and achievable aspects of your relationship rather than the idealized fantasy. For example, let's work on setting realistic goals for our real relationship and find ways to enjoy the present while addressing our challenges. So, in overall, to be precise, you have to understand the idealized vision. Recognize that her fantasy involves unrealistic expectations about the relationship and life, or it might even be a he. You have to acknowledge this discrepancy. See how this fantasy impacts your relationship and personal well-being. And at the same time, you have to facilitate a realistic discussion. Engage in a conversation to address the gap between the fantasy and reality, aiming to establish a more practical and fulfilling approach to your relationship. In this example, recognizing the fantasy involves understanding that her idealized vision of the relationship is unrealistic and addressing how this affects both of you. The goal is to have an honest discussion about the challenges and work towards a more practical and realistic perspective. So too, the next thing you can do to deal about this kind of a situation is assess your goals. Determine what you want to achieve by challenging or dismantling this fantasy. Are you looking for personal growth, a more realistic relationship, or something else? And by the way, these are tips on how you can dismantle the shared fantasy with your partner in order to be able to heal. So the next thing which you need to do is assess your goals in order to dismantle your partner's fantasy. For example, you are in a relationship with someone who has an idealized view of how the relationship should be, believing that everything should always be perfect and without conflict. This fantasy is leading to frequent unrealistic expectations and dissatisfaction in your relationship. Assessing your goals. You want to be more realistic in your relationship. You want to address their unrealistic expectations to create a more grounded and realistic relationship. And the approach you could go about with is you aim to have a conversation about the real dynamics of your relationship and set expectations that align more closely with reality. For example, I think it's important for us to discuss the realities of our relationship and work on setting realistic expectations so that we can both feel more satisfied and understood. And the second goal you need to have is to have an improved communication. And your aim should be that you want to enhance communication by addressing their idealized fantasies and fostering more open and honest dialogue. And the approach you could go about is you might focus on discussing specific instances where the person's expectations were unrealistic and how they impacted your communication. For instance, let's talk about how we can better communicate our needs and expectations, especially when things don't go as perfectly as we hoped. And the third goal which you might have is for personal growth. And your objective would be that you seek personal growth by challenging the fantasy and understanding your own needs and boundaries better. And your approach should be like you might reflect on how the person's idealized view affects you personally and work on your own emotional resilience and self-awareness. For example, I need to understand how I'm feeling about our current expectations and how I can better assert my own needs and boundaries while we walk through this. And the fourth goal you might have is for relationship stability in order to be able to deal with this. And your objective should be that you want to stabilize the relationship by addressing the fantasy and finding a common ground. And your approach should be like you focus on finding solutions that balance both their desires and your practical realities. For example, let's set some realistic goals for our relationship that we can both agree on so we can work together, achieving them together without feeling pressured. So the aim for all this thing is the dynamics for assessing your goals should be clarify your objectives. Clearly determine what you hope to achieve by addressing the fantasy. Are you aiming for a more realistic relationship, better communication, personal growth, or something else? 2, align actions. Tailor your approach to align with your specific goals. If your goal is improved communication, focus on discussing how to address misunderstandings. If it's personal growth, reflect on how to manage your responses and boundaries. And 3, evaluate outcomes. Assess how well your approach is meeting your goals and be prepared to adjust your strategies if needed. In this example, assessing your goals involves determining what you hope to achieve by challenging their idealized view and aligning your actions to support those specific objectives. And by giving these tips, I'm not telling anyone that you have to deal with it. These are just some of the ways that you can use in order to be able to deal with such kind of a narcissistic kind of a relationship. But you don't have to deal with it. So the next thing which you can do in order to be able to deal with such kind of a thing is communicate clearly. When addressing the fantasy, use clear and non-confrontational language. Focus on specific behaviors or beliefs rather than making general or personal criticisms. For example, instead of saying you're always so unrealistic, you might say, I've noticed that we have different views on this situation, and I think it's important to discuss them. For example, you're in a relationship with someone who has an idealized view of how romantic gestures should be, often expecting grand and frequent displays of affection. However, you feel overwhelmed by the pressure and want to discuss a more balanced approach. So you need to communicate clearly. Less effective approach would be, you're always so unrealistic about how often you want grand gestures. It's too much for me to handle. And a more effective approach would be, for example, you could say, I've noticed that we have different expectations about romantic gestures. I really value our relationship and want to find a balance that works for both of us. Can we talk about how we can manage our expectations and find ways to show affection that feel comfortable for both of us? So the dynamics of communicating clearly are, you focus on specific behaviors, address the specific behavior. Example, the expectation for grand gestures rather than making general criticisms about their unrealistic expectations. You use non-confrontational language. Frame the conversation in a way that invites dialogue and cooperation rather than creating defensiveness. Encourage discussion. Aim for a collaborative approach to finding a mutually acceptable solution rather than placing blame or making it about personal shortcomings. And so in this example, communicating clearly involves discussing differing expectations in a way that is constructive and respectful, fostering a dialogue about how both partners can align their views on romantic gestures. So our next tip is the fourth one, which is you set boundaries. Establish firm boundaries about what you are willing to tolerate. Narcissists may push back or try to manipulate, so it's important to remain consistent and assertive. Certainly, here's an example. For example, you're in a relationship with Taylor, who often disregards your need for personal time. And this person frequently calls or texts you during your work hours or when you've communicated that you need time to focus on yourself. So you need to set boundaries. Establish a clear boundary. You decide to address this issue by setting a firm boundary. You say to the person, I need to focus on my work during the day and also make time for myself in the evenings. I will be available to talk after 6 p.m. and on weekends. And you have to communicate assertively. And when that person responds with frustration or tries to argue, you maintain your stance. For example, they might say, you're always too busy for me. Why can't you just answer when I call? You respond calmly and assertively. I understand that you want to stay in touch, but I need this time for my work and personal space. It's important for me to maintain this balance. And you have to remain consistent. Even if they try to manipulate or push back by creating guilt or claiming you're neglecting the relationship, you stick to your boundary. If they send messages or calls during the restricted times, you don't respond until the agreed upon time. And reiterate as needed. If they continue to challenge the boundary, reiterate it calmly and consistently. As we discussed, I'm not available during these times. Let's talk after 6 p.m. as agreed. This is what you can say. So be firm and clear. Clearly define what you need. Example, personal time and boundaries around communication, and communicate it directly. Be assertive in your communication. Be firm but polite when discussing and enforcing your boundaries, avoiding defensiveness or guilt. And stay consistent. Maintain your boundaries consistently, even if faced with resistance or attempts to manipulate, to ensure they are respected. In this example, setting boundaries involves clearly defining your limits regarding personal time and communication, and remaining consistent in enforcing those boundaries despite any pushback or attempts at manipulation by them. And the fifth one, which you can use in order to deal with such kind of a situation, is focus on facts. Present evidence and practical considerations rather than emotional appeals. Narcissists are more likely to respond to concrete facts rather than feelings. And here's an example. For example, you are in a relationship with someone who often dismisses your concerns about their lack of participation in household responsibilities. When you bring up the issue, they tend to respond defensively, focusing on how hard they work and how their efforts should be enough. Your initial approach should be, instead of expressing frustration or making emotional appeals, you present specific evidence about the distribution of tasks. You might say, I've noticed that over the past month, I've been handling 80% of the household chores, instead including cooking, cleaning, and grocery shopping. Here's a summary of the tasks each of us has taken on, and you can give them the list. And you should have practical considerations. You then outline practical steps to address the imbalance, to ensure that the workload is shared more equally. I suggest we create a core schedule. This way, we can both clearly see and agree on our responsibilities, which should help balance the workload. And just anticipate any kind of resistance. If they respond defensively, you remain focused on the facts. And you say, I understand you're feeling overwhelmed, but these figures reflect the actual distribution of tasks. I think creating a schedule will help us both manage our responsibilities more fairly. And with this, when you present concrete evidence using specific data or examples, the percentage of cores handled to illustrate your point clearly, and you propose practical solutions, offer actionable steps or solutions based on the facts, such as a core schedule, and then you maintain objectivity, stay calm and factual, even if faced with resistance, to keep the discussion productive and focused on resolving the issue. In this example, focusing on facts helps to address the issue with them in a way that is more likely to be acknowledged and acted upon, rather than getting sidetracked by emotional responses of defensiveness. So the next thing you can do is just prepare for resistance. Be ready for pushback or denial. Narcissists may resist or reject anything that threatens their idealized view of reality. They might try to invalidate your perspective or shift the blame. For example, you're in a relationship with someone who has an idealized view of themselves as the perfect partner. And they frequently claim that they are always supportive and attentive, even though you feel neglected and unappreciated. So you need to address the issue. And your initial approach, you decide to have a conversation with them to address your feelings. You calmly explain. For example, you could say, I've been feeling overwhelmed lately because I often feel like my needs and feelings are not being acknowledged. For example, when I mentioned needing support with my work, it seemed like it was dismissed rather than addressed. And here you have to anticipate for resistance when you say this. They might react defensively, saying things like, I've always been supportive, you're just too demanding and never satisfied with what I do. Maybe you're the one who is not appreciating me enough. So be prepared to have a response. So stay calm and prepared to respond without getting defensive. You might say, I understand that you feel that way, but the feedback I'm giving is based on my experience. I believe it's important for us to discuss how we can both feel heard and supported in our relationship. Can we work on finding ways to address my needs while also understanding yours? So here, to summarize it, you should anticipate pushback. Recognize that they might deny or minimize your feelings and may try to shift the blame. Stay focused on your needs. Stick to expressing your feelings and the specific behaviors that they are affecting you, rather than getting sidetracked by their defensive responses. And offer solutions if you can. Emphasize the importance of mutual understanding and propose concrete steps or changes that could improve the relationship. In this example, preparing for resistance involves expecting them to challenge or deny your perspective and being ready to handle their reactions with a focus on constructive solutions and maintaining clarity about your own needs. And the next thing that you can do, the seventh thing that you can do in order to deal with this, is have self-care. Protect your own mental and emotional well-being. Engaging with a narcissist can be draining, so make sure you have a support system and strategies for self-care. For example, you are in a relationship with someone who often prioritizes their own needs and desires while dismissing your feelings. This dynamic leaves you feeling emotionally drained and unappreciated. So practicing self-care, you do it by establishing boundaries. Set clear boundaries to protect your mental well-being. For instance, you might decide to limit the time you spend discussing emotionally draining topics with them, saying, for example, I need some space to focus on my own needs right now. Let's discuss this later when I'm feeling more balanced. So at the same time, you build a support system for yourself. Connect with friends and family who understand your situation and can offer emotional support. Schedule regular meetups or calls with them to share your experiences and get perspective. And engage yourself in personal activities. Prioritize activities that rejuvenate you and bring you joy, such as hobbies, exercise, or relaxation practices. For example, you might set aside time each week for yoga or reading, which helps you unwind and regain your energy. And you should seek professional help. Consider talking to a therapist or counselor who can provide strategies for managing your emotional well-being and navigating the relationship dynamics. So you protect your well-being. Actively take steps to maintain your mental and emotional health despite the challenges of the relationship. You implement boundaries, clearly define and maintain boundaries to manage the impact of the narcissistic behavior on your life, and you utilize support resources. Rely on your support system and self-care strategies to counterbalance the emotional toll of the relationship. In this example, self-care involves setting boundaries, building a supportive network, engaging in personal activities, and seeking professional help to protect and maintain your well-being while dealing with a narcissistic partner. And the next thing, the eighth thing which you can do is consider professional guidance. If the situation is particularly challenging, consulting a mental health professional can provide strategies tailored to your specific circumstances. For example, you are in a relationship with somebody who displays narcissistic traits. They frequently invalidate your feelings, make unilateral decisions, and insist that their perspective is always correct. Despite your efforts to address these issues, the relationship remains strained and you're feeling increasingly frustrated and overwhelmed. So, seeking professional guidance will make you recognize the need. After several attempts to address the issues with them, you realize that the situation is too complex and emotionally taxing to handle on your own. You acknowledge that you could benefit from professional support to navigate the relationship dynamics and improve your coping strategies. And when you consult a therapist, you decide to seek the help of a licensed therapist or counselor who specializes in relationship dynamics and narcissistic behavior. During your sessions, you explain the challenges you're facing with them, such as the constant invalidation of your feelings and the difficulty in reaching mutually satisfying solutions. So here you receive tailored strategies. The therapist helps you develop specific strategies to manage your interactions with them. This might include effective communication techniques, learning how to communicate your needs more assertively while maintaining emotional detachment. It might include boundary setting, gaining guidance on establishing and maintaining healthy boundaries with them. It might include self-care practices, incorporating self-care routines and stress management techniques to protect your emotional well-being. So at the same time you implement strategies, you start applying the strategies discussed with your therapist, such as practicing assertive communication and setting clear boundaries. You also make time for self-care activities and seek regular support from your therapist to address ongoing challenges. So you acknowledge complexity, recognize when the relationship issues are beyond your ability to resolve alone and seek professional support. You get tailored strategies from your therapist, work with a mental health professional to develop strategies that are specifically suited to your situation, enhancing your ability to manage the relationship dynamics effectively. And you get ongoing support. Use the guidance and support from the therapist to improve your coping skills, strengthen your boundaries, and maintain your emotional well-being. In this example, considering professional guidance involves seeking a therapist to help navigate the complexities of the relationship with the narcissist, providing you with tailored strategies and ongoing support to handle the challenging dynamics effectively. And so that's how you will manage to be able to deal with such kind of relationship if you're in and you feel you're stuck and you're not able to get out. But there is always a way out for everything, and there is always a solution for all problems. And these are some of the solutions that you can use to deal with such kind of narcissistic kind of abuses. And that's what I'm guided to give off right now, and I hope it helps somebody. I will be back with part 2, where we will be talking about the types of shared fantasy between you and the narcissist, because many people don't know. They know there is a shared fantasy and it has to be dismantled and destroyed, but at the same time they might not know how or what kind of a shared fantasy is, or what types. There are so many of them. And so I will be back in part 2 with the types of shared fantasy between you and the narcissist. So till next time, the next one, until the next one, take care and God bless.